Welcome to Minnesota Housing's Supportive Housing tutorial. This session provides information for applicants who will include supportive housing units in their funding application. Minnesota Housing's mission is to provide access to safe, decent, affordable housing and build stronger communities across the state by offering products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. Minnesota Housing also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both the financing and long-term asset management of projects and developments. The agency has also pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. This session will cover changes in 2019 for supportive housing, the submission requirements for applicants who plan to include supportive housing units in their development for people who are homeless, and requirements for supportive housing units for people with disabilities. The session will also provide information on housing support, formerly known as Group Residential Housing or GRH, and coordinated entry. It will provide information about Olmstead principles and considerations for supportive housing settings. Finally, you will also learn about a unique resource, the National Housing Trust Fund. Minnesota Housing has significant resources for supportive housing developments due to the addition of Housing Infrastructure Bonds, or HIB, as a funding source. These funds can be used for 100% supportive housing developments, serving households experiencing homelessness or people with behavioral health needs. The supportive housing for homeless households can include high-priority homeless, people leaving institutions without a permanent residence, or other types of homeless eligibility. Supportive housing for people with behavioral health needs is intended for people with substance use disorder or mental health service needs. Households do not have to be homeless. Applicants that designate units for high-priority homeless households or people with disabilities are eligible to receive specific points on their housing tax credit or deferred funding application. Applicants must indicate if they are applying for HIB funds on the Intend to Apply form and also describe the type of households that will be served in the supportive housing units. Refer to the HIB program guide that can be found on our website for more information. There is a change this year for applicants that plan to create units for people with disabilities. The owner must have a service agreement with the county or tribal human services entity. Having an agreement with an independent service provider is no longer an option. We have also updated our tenant selection plan guidance to provide more specific expectations for properties selected for funding. All projects that plan to serve specific populations, such as high-priority homeless or people with disabilities, need to have tenant selection plans that specifically address the population that will be served. Minnesota Housing will review tenant selection plans prior to loan closing to make sure the plan is structured to adequately reach the intended population. For more information, refer to the new guidance posted on our website. Here's a quick review of basic requirements for all applications with supportive housing units. These documents can be found on our website or online in the portal and must be completed in their entirety and submitted with your application. For the supportive housing narrative, please make sure to thoroughly answer all of the questions to give us a good picture of your supportive housing plan. The owner, the property manager, and the service provider must work together to complete the narrative. Also note that the development must have a designated service provider at the time of application to be considered feasible. The service provider must sign the narrative. The Continuum of Care, or COC confirmation form, is a form that must be signed by the COC to confirm that the proposed units meet a need in the service area. The COCs expect all applicants to complete the development information form to provide information to the COC committee before they will complete the form. Most COCs meet monthly, so applicants need to contact the COC coordinator as soon as possible to make arrangements to attend the COC meeting to present their development information. Contact information is provided on the COC form. The Human Services Confirmation Letter must also be submitted by the application due date, so please contact your county or tribal human services office as soon as possible so they have time to review your proposal and complete the letter. The last document is the Service Provider Qualification Form. This form can be submitted by the service provider any time before the Request for Proposals, or RFP, due date. It must be uploaded to our online multifamily application portal. There are also a few things that need to be correctly filled out in the workbook. On the Project Description tab in the Demographics table, be sure to enter the number of permanent supportive housing units for the development. This includes all homeless, behavioral health, and people with disabilities, or PWD, units. And on the Housing Income tab, be sure to indicate which units will be used for high-priority homeless households. Click the High Priority Homeless, or HPH box, and also make sure to indicate if they have rental assistance and the source of that rental assistance. To qualify for the High Priority Homeless points, all applications must meet the threshold criteria, which include: for supportive services, the level and type of services offered should be appropriate for the needs of the population to be served, with a minimum tenant service coordination for an average of 2 hours per household per week. For an experienced service provider with demonstrated outcomes, at a minimum, the service provider has experience providing services to a similar population to maintain housing over a period of time, and the service provider has sufficient capacity to deliver the services proposed. For service funding commitments, at a minimum, a portion of service funding is secured, and there is a viable plan for securing the remaining resources. The applicant must provide evidence in the application narrative and upload funding commitment documentation to the multifamily online application portal. And finally, for coordinated entry, the property owner must agree to accept referrals through coordinated entry for the high-priority homeless units. Evidence for meeting the threshold criteria must be provided in the supportive housing narrative, service provider qualification form, and funding commitment documents, which must be uploaded to our online multifamily application portal. Many properties use housing support to pay tenant rents. Housing support is a state-funded income supplement that pays for housing costs for extremely low-income adults with a disabling condition. The County Human Services Office administers the program and enters into agreements with providers, which is generally the supportive housing service provider, but in some cases, it could be the property owner or management agent. Many counties, including Hennepin County, offer an annual request for proposals, or RFP, to select new housing support properties and providers, so it is important to contact the county early in your development planning process. The housing support benefit amount is currently $922 per month. Refer to our underwriting standards, which can be found on our website at www.mnhousing.gov. for information about how to set the rents for the housing support units. There is also a supplemental service rate available for service providers, but the tenants must be long-term homeless. For the RFP, applicants must submit evidence of an agreement with the county to enter into a housing support agreement. If you'd like to learn more about housing support, there is a link on our website to the Minnesota Department of Human Services webpage, which is also referred to as DHS, for the Housing Support Program. Applicants may also contact DHS or county staff for technical assistance. I will now address coordinated entry and how it works for supportive housing. Coordinated entry, or CE, as it is sometimes referred to, is a HUD requirement for continuums of care, or COCs, and state agencies also require coordinated entry participation by all housing providers and service providers. Each local COC has its own policies and processes for coordinated entry, but basic aspects are as follows. Any person seeking homeless assistance can go to a central access point to apply. They won't have to go from office to office to find someone to help them. The household will be assessed to determine the type of housing service they need. If the service is available, the household will be referred to the appropriate housing or service provider. If the appropriate service is not available at the time, the household will be placed on a waiting list. The households that are placed on the waiting list are prioritized by highest need. For supportive housing providers, when you have a unit available, you must notify the coordinated entry contact person. They will refer households to you from the top of the waiting list that appear to meet the eligibility criteria for the unit. The referred households will then go through your standard application process. Note that all Minnesota Housing Finance developments that have high-priority homeless units must use coordinated entry for all referrals for open units. We also want to call your attention to the opportunity to create units for people with disabilities. Remember that these units cannot be the same units as the supportive housing units for high-priority homeless households, and they cannot be in a property with age-restricted units. There's a key difference between high-priority homeless and people with disabilities in regard to who is responsible for providing supportive services. While the developer is responsible for providing services for high-priority homeless and other supportive housing units, the County or Tribal Human Services Office will be responsible for providing services for people with disabilities through mainstream resources such as Medicaid-funded services. In addition, the county or tribe will determine the populations to be served and the referral process for these units. Developers should consult with their local Human Services Office to learn about the housing needs for people with disabilities. Most counties are working to transition people from care facilities back into the community. Applicants will need to have a service agreement with the County or Tribal Human Services Office. Refer to the scoring criteria for specific information that must be included in the agreement. The application narrative for people with disabilities must be completed and can also serve as a service agreement if it is signed by the Human Services entity. Applications must also meet the threshold criteria outlined on the self-scoring worksheet to be eligible for the points. I also want to point out that the income restriction for these units is 30% of multifamily tax subsidy income limits, or MTSP, so it is important to have a rental subsidy for tenants. If a subsidy is not available for these units, the rent levels can be underwritten at the supportive housing underwriting standard. And finally, applicants must indicate which units will be PWD units on the Housing Income tab on the workbook. For applicants that are proposing a number of units for people with disabilities, including homeless units serving adults with disabilities, consider the principles of the state's Olmstead Plan in your development. The plan is a broad series of key activities Minnesota must accomplish to ensure people with disabilities are living, learning, working, and enjoying life in the most integrated setting. The key elements are choice and independence so that people with disabilities have the opportunity to live independently, to live close to their family and friends, to engage in productive employment, and to participate in community life. People should have as much choice and independence as possible. They should have a lease and control of their own unit. They should have the freedom to come and go as they please, have visitors, make their own choices for daily activities, and have opportunities to participate fully in community life. And, to the extent possible, people with similar disabilities should not be grouped together at the property, and they should be able to choose their own services and service provider. Applicants planning to use Home and Community-Based Services, or HCBS, in their development must be aware of the new federal rule for HCBS setting guidelines. The Minnesota Department of Human Services, also known as DHS, evaluates all settings using HCBS to ensure compliance with the rule. If the property triggers a potential isolating characteristic, such as having more than 25% of units serve people with disabilities and providing multiple services on site, the service provider will need to provide evidence to DHS that the setting meets HCBS guidelines, which are essentially the principles outlined in the Olmstead Plan. For more information about the HCBS rule, refer to the Supportive Housing Information and Resources publication that can be found on Minnesota Housing's website at www.mnhousing.gov. We anticipate having funding again this year from the National Housing Trust Fund. Since the funds are limited to serve people with extremely low incomes, Minnesota Housing prioritizes these funds for supportive housing. The funds can be used for capital costs for new construction or the reuse of an unoccupied building. Minnesota Housing can also allocate up to 30% of the total funding to help pay for operating costs for assisted units for up to 15 years. If you plan to apply for the National Housing Trust Fund operating subsidy, there are some specific application materials and tools for you to review and/or complete, including a short narrative and a calculation tool for determining the operating subsidy amount needed. Also remember to look for the instructions for completing certain sections of the workbook to show the operating subsidy information. Finally, we want to thank you for all you do to provide supportive housing to people experiencing homelessness, people with disabilities, or those with behavioral health needs. For more information about supportive housing, please contact Vicki Farden or Joel Salzer, or visit our website at www.mnhousing.gov. Select the Multifamily Partners section on the right side of the page, and under the Apply for Funding tab, select Supportive Housing. Thank you for taking the time to view this tutorial.